An issue that comes up an awful lot in the state of Texas, more than you'd really think that it would, involves the Statute of Frauds. What the Statute of Frauds is it's a set of rules that basically say that if an agreement's not in writing, it's not enforceable. Even if everyone agrees, yeah, we had an agreement, but you know what? It's not in writing. Sorry, it's not enforceable. The general rule is, for all contracts that don't involve the types of things subject to the Statute of Frauds, that oral contracts are just as enforceable as written contracts. Now, this doesn't mean that oral contracts are just as good as written contracts. It just means that as a matter of law, if you prove that there's an oral contract, it's enforceable just like you had a written contract. Now, in practice, proving you've got a written contract, while there's all kinds of exceptions, not always as easy or as straightforward as you might think it is generally a whole lot easier because you've got a contract that you can look at and say, here's our agreement. Now, there's all kinds of issues with interpretation. It's rarely that straightforward, but you at least don't have the initial hurdle of proving that there's some kind of agreement, and then also proving exactly what that agreement is, which, when you've got a written contract, there can sometimes be issues with it. But if you're just relying on someone's word, it's real easy not to agree on exactly what one side was supposed to do or what the other side was supposed to get. Now, the main types of agreements that are subject to the Statute of Frauds that you see more often than any other kind are real estate. Any deal for real estate needs to be in writing. Basically, the legislature decides if it's important enough, and real estate, generally speaking, is a pretty important, pretty sizable issue that you're dealing with. If you care enough to have something like that, by law it has to be in writing. Now, another one that's very, very common are contracts that are not performable within 1 year. For example, if you have a contract to do something that involves 3 years, 5 years, or 6 years, then it has to be in writing, or even if everyone agrees that there is a contract like that, it's not enforceable. Now, this can be really tricky, and another thing to keep in mind that applies to all issues involving the Statute of Frauds is that the Statute of Frauds, at least in Texas, is always applied very strictly and construed very strictly. And what that means is, for the issue of performable within a year, that means that even if it's not performed within a year, if it can be performed within a year, the courts are not going to apply the Statute of Frauds. Which means if you promise to do something for the rest of your life, that does not fall under the Statute of Frauds, because theoretically you're not going to live for a full year. Any one of us could pass away at any time. So the Statute of Frauds will not apply to that. Also, any kind of contract to pay another person's debt, to be responsible for another person's debt, it has to be in writing. Also, any loan agreement more than $50,000 has to be in writing. Whether there's a Statute of Frauds or not, that is a big enough and a substantial enough contract that it's best just to have everything in writing, even if everybody trusts everybody. That way, everybody knows what their rights are, everybody knows what their responsibilities are. Now, just because somebody has an oral agreement, even if it's clearly subject to the Statute of Frauds, which isn't always very clear, doesn't mean that if somebody gets cheated or the other person doesn't perform, that there's absolutely no remedies available to them. In fact, very frequently there's exceptions. There's what's called equitable remedies that the court might apply. So just because someone thinks that something applies and that the Statute of Frauds is going to keep something to be enforceable, it's certainly worth investigating, certainly worth looking into, certainly worth talking to a lawyer to see if maybe something can be done. A lot of times it's an issue, something that has to be dealt with, but just because the Statute of Frauds applies doesn't mean that there's necessarily nothing that can be done.